The sound cut through the air like a crack of thunder, a child's desperate cry, echoing across the marble floor of the Galleria Mall in downtown Manhattan. For a man like Charles Howard, it was the kind of sound that didn't belong in his world. He was used to the silence of boardrooms, the soft hum of private jets, the smooth rhythm of power, not the chaos of a crying child. He turned sharply, instinct overriding logic. Near the central fountain, under the glow of the glass ceiling, a little boy stood alone. 3 years old, maybe 4. His small hands clutched a red toy car that had lost one wheel, and tears streamed down his round, flushed cheeks. "Mommy." The boy sobbed again, his voice trembling with real terror. Shoppers passed by, pretending not to hear. That was New York for you people too busy, too guarded, to stop for someone else's pain. But Charles stopped. The CEO of Howard Enterprises, a man whose signature could move millions in the market, whose net worth sat somewhere north of $7 billion, found himself frozen in front of a frightened child. His assistant's voice buzzed faintly through his earpiece. "Mr. Howard, your car is ready." He didn't respond. Charles crouched down, the polished leather of his shoes creasing as he met the boy's eyes, storm-gray eyes that made his heart lurch for reasons he couldn't name. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice losing its usual sharp authority. "Did you lose your mom?" The boy sniffled, hiccuping. "Can't find Mommy. She was right here. She went to buy a car." "A car?" Charles blinked, confused. The boy held up the broken toy. "A toy car. Mine's broken." Despite himself, Charles smiled faintly. "Ah, I see. You've got good taste. Ferrari, huh?" The boy's lower lip wobbled. "Red one. It's fast. I believe it," Charles said, reaching out and gently brushing away the child's tears with the back of his hand. He had no idea why the gesture felt so natural. "What's your name, Caleb?" The boy whispered. "Caleb Campbell." Campbell. The name tugged at something deep in his memory, a whisper of the past he wasn't ready to face. He pushed the thought away and glanced around. The mall was busy, sunlight filtering through the high windows, glinting off the steel and glass storefronts. People were moving everywhere, yet no one looked like they were searching for a child. "All right," Caleb Charles said gently. "Let's find your mom, okay? She's probably just as worried as you are." Caleb nodded hesitantly. "Okay. Mind if I carry you? We'll see better from up high." The boy lifted his arms without hesitation, and as Charles lifted him, the child's small hands wrapped around his neck with complete trust. The weight was light, but grounding, as though something deep within him, something long dormant, clicked into place. The boy's curls brushed his chin. The warmth of that small body, the innocent scent of baby shampoo. It was foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. Charles Howard, the man the business press called the Iron Executive, had never held a child in his life. But at that moment, holding Caleb, he realized there were empires in this world that had nothing to do with money. He started walking. "So what's your mom like?" he asked as they moved past the designer shops. Caleb's face brightened a little. "She's pretty. She has brown skin like chocolate, and her hair smells like flowers. And she laughs funny." Charles chuckled under his breath. "That sounds nice." "She reads me stories about dinosaurs," Caleb continued proudly. "She says they were big but not mean. Like people. Like people, huh? Uh-huh." They passed the toy store, the coffee shop, the children's clothing boutique, but no one called out for Caleb. Security guards lingered at a distance, murmuring into radios, watching Charles warily. He ignored them. Sir, one finally said, approaching. "We're handling this. You can hand the child over to us. I'm sure you'll follow your protocol." Charles replied evenly, his CEO tone returning for a moment. But until you find his mother, he stays with me. Something in his voice, quiet authority, mixed with something more, made the guard hesitate, then nod. Caleb relaxed against him, small fingers curling into his expensive suit. You smell like my mommy's candles, he murmured sleepily. Charles blinked. Candles, yeah. The kind that smell like home. That word hit him like a punch. Home. For Charles, home had always been the penthouse with the city skyline, the place filled with glass chrome and silence. But suddenly it felt like a cold word. Mommy, Caleb suddenly cried, jolting upright. His tiny hand shot forward. There she is. Charles turned, following the boy's gaze, and in that instant, the world stilled. Through the crowd, a woman came running, a flash of caramel-brown skin, black curls flying, loose eyes, wide with panic. Her beauty hit him like a forgotten melody. She wore a simple white blouse, jeans, no jewelry, except a gold chain glinting at her throat. She looked nothing like the glamorous women who usually populated his circles, and yet she was the only person he could see. Elena. The name escaped his lips like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. She froze mid-step. Her gaze fell on Caleb, then on Charles holding him, and the color drained from her face. Charles, she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb wriggled excitedly in his arms. Mommy? The nice man helped me. Elena blinked rapidly, a tear escaping down her cheek. Put him down, Charles, please. He didn't move. He's yours. Her throat tightened. He's mine. Charles looked at Caleb, at those storm-gray eyes, identical to his own, and his pulse quickened. Elena. His voice cracked. How old is he? She shook her head desperately. Not here. Please, not here. Caleb looked between them, sensing the tension. Mommy, are you mad? No, baby, she said softly, brushing his hair. Mommy's just surprised. But the truth was written in the air between them, in the mirrored color of their eyes, in the trembling of her hands, in the unspoken years between their hearts. Charles's breath came slow and uneven. 3 years old, he murmured, almost to himself. Caleb, 3 years. Elena's voice broke. Please, Charles, don't. He swallowed hard, forcing his composure. But the steel in his spine faltered. You kept him from me, he whispered. Didn't you? Her eyes filled with tears. You didn't want a family. You made that clear. Around them, curious onlookers began to whisper. Cameras flashed. A billionaire in the middle of the Galleria, holding a child who looked exactly like him. New York loved a scandal. Charles's chest rose and fell, emotion warring with disbelief. My God, he said quietly, looking at the boy who stared up at him with such innocent curiosity. He's mine, isn't he? And in that instant, as Caleb's small voice piped up, Are you my daddy? The world tilted. Everything Charles Howard had built, his empire, his image, his control, began to crack under the weight of one child's truth. Elena's tears fell freely now. Please, Charles, she whispered. Not here. But the damage was done. The secret she'd protected for years was out, and nothing would ever be the same. For the first time in a long time, Charles felt his heart beating for something real, something terrifyingly fragile. He looked down at the little boy in his arms, then back at the woman he'd once loved and lost. And as his world unraveled in the middle of a crowded mall, he realized it might finally be the start of something worth living for. If you've ever believed that second chances are impossible, stay with me. Because what happens next will remind you that love, no matter how long it hides, always finds its way back. The cafe on the upper level was quieter than the rest of the Galleria, tucked between a bookstore and a florist that smelled faintly of lavender. The noise of the mall below faded into a distant hum, but the silence between Charles and Elena was louder than anything. Caleb sat between them in a high chair, his small hands clutching a juice box, oblivious to the invisible war waging across the table. Charles couldn't look away from him. Every tiny movement, every blink, every tilt of his head was like watching a reflection of his own childhood come alive. Elena's voice broke the stillness. "Please, Charles, don't make a scene. Not here." He leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table. A scene. His tone was calm, but beneath it, something cracked. "You show up out of nowhere, with a child who looks exactly like me, and you think I shouldn't react." Elena glanced toward Caleb, who was humming softly to himself, playing with his straw. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Lower your voice. He doesn't understand any of this yet." Charles's eyes softened slightly at that, but his voice remained steady. "Then explain it to me. Help me understand what the hell happened. How did I spend 3 years living without knowing I had a son?" She closed her eyes, her lashes trembling. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Then how was it supposed to be?" Elena drew in a shaky breath. "You made your choice, Charles. You made it the night I packed my bags. Remember that?" His jaw tightened. "I remember you walking out. I remember begging you to stay. You begged me between phone calls, between meetings, between your empire and your ego." Her words came out sharper than she intended. "I wasn't your partner anymore, Charles. I was a placeholder. You were married to your ambition." He stared at her for a long time, his mind flipping through years of sleepless nights and unanswered calls. "You think I didn't miss you," he said finally, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You think I didn't regret every damn thing I said to you." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Regret came too late. Charles swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "And what about Caleb? Did he deserve to grow up without a father? Because you decided I wasn't ready?" Elena's composure broke for the first time. She pressed her palms against her knees, trembling. "You don't know what it was like, Charles. I tried. I called. 17 times, maybe more. I went to your office. Security turned me away." His eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible." I spoke to your assistant." She interrupted, her voice shaking. "She said you were not available for personal matters involving your ex-wife." That was the exact phrase. Charles felt a cold wave of guilt wash over him. He remembered those days, the chaos after the divorce, the endless expansion deals, the way he'd ordered everyone to keep Elena out of his professional life. He'd thought it was a clean break. He'd thought it was necessary to move on. He hadn't realized he'd built a wall so high that even his own family couldn't reach him. "Elena," his voice faltered. "If I'd known, you didn't want to know," she whispered, and that hurt more than any accusation. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the quiet slurp of Caleb finishing his juice box, and the muffled laughter of other patrons nearby. Caleb wriggled in his seat. "Mommy, I have to go potty." Elena rose immediately, grateful for the excuse to escape. "Come on, sweetheart." Charles watched them go. Watched his son's little hand clutch his mother's, and the ache in his chest grew heavier. For 3 years, he'd measured success by numbers and headlines. But here was proof that the most important thing he could have built, the one legacy that actually mattered, had existed without him. When they returned, Caleb looked content, humming again, as he climbed into his chair. Elena sat down slowly, avoiding Charles's gaze. "Does he know anything about me?" he asked. She hesitated. "He knows he's loved. That's all that mattered." Charles's voice softened. "Does he ask?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "He asks why he doesn't have a daddy like the other kids in preschool. I tell him that his daddy is somewhere out there working hard doing important things." Her lips trembled. "I didn't want him to hate you before he ever met you." That undid him completely. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who'd left, but the woman who had survived on her own. The sleepless nights, the endless strength it must have taken to raise a child alone while keeping his name buried. "Elena," he said quietly, "you shouldn't have had to do it alone." She looked at him, then her dark eyes glistening. "And yet I did." Caleb tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, can we go home soon, baby?" Charles leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I want to be part of his life." Her expression tightened. "It's not that simple." "It can be," he said. "I missed 3 years of him, and I'll be damned if I miss another day. You can't just walk back in Charles. You can't expect him to understand who you are overnight. He doesn't even know your name." "Then I'll earn it." Her brow furrowed. "Earn what?" "The right to hear him say, 'Dad.'" Something in her broke then, perhaps the last of the walls she'd built around herself. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to detect a lie. But the man sitting across from her wasn't the same one she had left. His voice didn't carry the impatience of power anymore. It carried the weight of loss. "All right," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "But you start slow. Visits, short ones. I don't want him confused or scared. Whatever you say. And no promises you can't keep." Charles nodded. "I'll keep this one." Caleb's giggle broke the heaviness between them as he began stacking sugar packets into a tiny tower. Charles watched, smiling faintly. "You like building things, huh?" The boy grinned. "Mommy says I can be an architect or a race car driver." Charles chuckled. "Ambitious already." Elena's lips curved into a reluctant smile. He gets that from somewhere. The mood softened for a while. They talked lightly about Caleb's favorite shows, his friends, his obsession with dinosaurs. Charles found himself laughing genuinely, laughing for the first time in months. It was surreal sitting there across from the woman he once loved, their son, between them, like the universe had conspired to give him a second chance. But as the minutes passed, the reality of it all weighed heavier. How do you rebuild something that had been buried for years? How do you reach for a child who doesn't know you yet? He decided he'd start with honesty. "Elena," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." She looked at him startled. "For what?" "For not showing up. For thinking that success would keep us safe. For making you feel like you were invisible in your own marriage." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. "I can't change what I did," he continued, "but I can change what I do now. I can be better for him and for you if you'll let me." "Don't make this about us," she said gently. "It's about him now." He nodded, though part of him couldn't help the thought. It was always about her. They finished the drinks in silence, both lost in memories of what they'd once shared. When they stepped out of the cafe, the light from the skylight poured over them, like a spotlight on a stage they never planned to return to. Caleb ran a few steps ahead, chasing the reflection of the fountain's water. Charles followed behind, watching him with quiet awe. "He's fearless," he murmured. Elena smiled faintly, "like someone I used to know." Charles turned to her, his gaze lingering. Do you ever think about us? She hesitated. Sometimes. Usually when he does something stubborn and I hear your voice in my head. That made him laugh softly, a sound tinged with regret. I deserved that. Her tone softened. You deserved a lot of things, Charles, but so did I. He nodded. Maybe we both still do. They stood in silence again, the air between them heavy, but somehow lighter than before. Caleb splashed a bit of water from the fountain and turned, laughing, his cheeks flushed with joy. It was such a small moment, yet it made something shift inside both of them, a fragile understanding that this wasn't the end of a conversation, but the beginning of something neither could yet define. When Elena finally gathered Caleb into her arms, she looked at Charles and said quietly, "We'll take this one step at a time. Don't rush him. Don't rush me." "I won't," he said. "I promise." She nodded, hesitated, and then turned to go. Charles watched them disappear into the crowd, the world around him resuming its normal pace. But nothing felt normal anymore. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, urgent, insistent, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he stayed by the fountain, staring at the rippling water, trying to make sense of the ache in his chest. He'd built towers of steel and glass. He'd bought companies, conquered markets, won wars that made headlines. But standing there with his son's laughter still echoing faintly in the distance, he realized he'd lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to make it right. He straightened his jacket, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, one step at a time. Then, for the first time in years, Charles Howard walked away from a business call unanswered, because something far more important was waiting. It was early Saturday morning when Charles found himself standing in front of a small townhouse on a quiet Brooklyn street, holding a bouquet of sunflowers and a box of chocolate muffins. The sun had just risen, spilling gold across the sidewalks, and the city was still half asleep. He wasn't used to this kind of silence. It unnerved him more than board meetings ever had. He had texted Elena the night before asking if he could visit. Her reply had been cautious. If Caleb's comfortable, yes, but no promises. He's shy with new people. New people. The words had stung, though they were true. He was new to his own son. When the door opened, the sight before him undid whatever poise he had rehearsed on the drive over. Caleb stood there in dinosaur pajamas, clutching a stuffed T-Rex, blinking up at him with sleepy curiosity. "Hi there," Charles said softly, his heart stuttering. "I brought breakfast." Caleb's eyes flicked to the flowers, then the muffins, then back to Charles. "Do you like dinosaurs?" The question threw him. "I think I do now," he said, smiling. "Okay," Caleb decided. "You can come in." From the living room, Elena appeared, tying her hair back with one hand. "Wow," she murmured. "He doesn't usually let anyone in before cartoons." "I bribed him with muffins," Charles said. "It works in boardrooms, apparently also with toddlers." Elena's lips curved in an involuntary smile. "You remembered I liked sunflowers." "I remembered everything," he said quietly. She looked away. "Coffee, please." The moment felt fragile, like walking on glass barefoot. But as the minutes passed, it began to settle into something gentle. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, showing off his dinosaur collection. Charles joined him, awkward at first, then slowly finding his rhythm. "This one's a triceratops," Caleb announced proudly. "It's strong but nice." Charles nodded gravely. "A very good combination." Caleb squinted at him. "You talk funny. I get that a lot. You sound like Mommy when she's mad at the TV." Elena nearly choked on her coffee. "Caleb." But Charles laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that filled the small room. "He's got your honesty," he said. He's got your sarcasm, she countered, but there was no malice in it, only memory. When Caleb finally turned back to his toys, Charles lowered his voice. He's incredible, Elena. You did everything right. She sipped her coffee slowly. I did what I could. He makes it easy to love him, and hard to let go. Her eyes flickered toward him. Charles. He held up a hand. I know. I'm not here to take anything away. I just want to be part of what's already here. Something in his tone, steady quiet, stripped of pride, made her soften a little. She nodded once. Then start by showing up. I can do that. Every week, she added like a challenge. Every day, if you'll let me. She looked at him, weighing those words. But before she could answer, Caleb called out, Mommy. Daddy's triceratops fell over. Both of them froze. Elena turned sharply to her son. What did you call him? Caleb blinked, unbothered. Daddy. That's what he is, right? For a moment, none of them breathed. Then Charles smiled faintly, a sheen of tears in his eyes. If that's what you want to call me, buddy, I'd be honored. Caleb grinned, triumphant, as if he had just solved a puzzle. Okay, Daddy. Elena's gaze softened. She didn't correct him. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small miracles. Pancakes in the kitchen. Crayon drawings on the table. Caleb insisting that Daddy wear a paper crown for his pretend dinosaur kingdom. The walls that had once separated them began to crumble, not with grand gestures, but with laughter, with shared glances, with a child's unfiltered love, stitching what pride had torn apart. At one point, while Caleb was napping on the couch, Charles and Elena found themselves standing by the window, sunlight pooling between them. He's so fearless, Charles said quietly. I keep wondering how I would have ruined that if I'd been there from the start. You wouldn't have ruined it, she said after a pause. You just would have learned differently. He glanced at her. Do you believe people can learn to be better? She hesitated. I believe they can try. But trying means change. I've already changed, he said simply. You just haven't seen it yet. Her expression softened, but she looked away again. I've heard promises before, Charles. I'm not promising, he said, his voice low. I'm proving. There was no anger in his words, only sincerity and something else. Something Elena had never heard from him before, humility. It was disarming. Caleb stirred, then yawning his curls, messy, his voice sleepy. Are you staying, Daddy? Charles looked at Elena, uncertain. She met his gaze, then gave the smallest nod. Yes, Charles said softly, his heart full. I'm staying. That day stretched longer than any day Charles had lived in years. He played until his knees ached, read picture books, until his voice was hoarse, and forgot entirely about his phone buzzing somewhere in his coat pocket. When the sun began to sink behind the rooftops, Elena cooked a simple dinner, pasta, garlic bread, and laughter that came easier now. For the first time in his adult life, Charles Howard didn't feel like a man trying to control his world. He felt like a man finally letting it in. After dinner, while Elena washed dishes, he leaned against the counter watching her. The kitchen light turned her hair gold, and for a heartbeat, it felt like nothing had ever gone wrong between them. Do you remember our first apartment? He asked quietly. She glanced up. The one with the leaky faucet and the noisy neighbors, he smiled. You used to say you couldn't sleep without the sound of that drip. I hated that sound, she said, laughing softly. I just didn't want you to spend another weekend trying to fix it. He chuckled. You always were better at pretending. Her laughter faded, replaced by something tender. And you were always better at forgetting what mattered. He nodded slowly. Not anymore. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with things neither dared to say. And then Caleb's small voice floated from the living room. "Mommy, Daddy, come look." When they stepped out, they found him standing proudly beside a tower of blocks, crooked but tall, wobbling slightly. "Look, I made our house." Charles crouched beside him. "It's perfect." Caleb shook his head. "It's missing something." "What's that? A roof?" "So it doesn't fall when it rains." Elena smiled. "We'll build the roof together tomorrow." Caleb nodded solemnly. "Okay, but Daddy has to come back." Charles met Elena's gaze again, his answer clear, before he even spoke. "I will." When he finally left that evening, he carried one of Caleb's drawings with him, a crayon picture of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun. Above them, in messy letters, Caleb had written, "Me, Mommy, Daddy." In the car, Charles sat for a long time, the drawing resting on the passenger seat. Outside, the city glittered, his empire. But for once, it all felt small. He picked up his phone, ignored the stream of messages, and instead typed a single text to Elena. "Thank you for today. For him. For still letting me try." Her reply came. Minutes later, he slept smiling. "That's enough for tonight." He smiled, started the car, and drove off through the quiet streets, his heart steady for the first time in years. That night, he didn't dream of boardrooms or headlines. He dreamed of pancakes, crayons, and laughter echoing through a home that wasn't silent anymore. And when he woke, the first thought that came wasn't about a deal or a merger or a stock price. It was about Caleb's words, "Daddy has to come back." Charles intended to keep that promise with every breath he had left, because sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or apologies. It comes in the quiet decision to stay, and in the small hands that reach out, trusting that this time you won't let go. The following weekend unfolded beneath a soft Manhattan sky, the kind of pale gold morning that seemed to hum with quiet possibilities. Charles stood in the kitchen of Elena's townhouse, sleeves rolled up, trying unsuccessfully to flip pancakes. The first one had burned, the second had folded in half, and the third lay mangled in the pan like a sad, edible accident. From the living room came Caleb's giggle, bright and unfiltered. "Mommy's pancakes don't look like that." Elena's laughter followed. "That's because Mommy uses a spatula, not a stockholder's report." Charles looked over his shoulder, feigning offense. "I'll have you know I'm a fast learner." Elena leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, watching him with that half-smile she used to wear when he tried to fix things that didn't need fixing. "You were always better at making a mess look expensive." "Then I suppose breakfast is going to be a masterpiece," he said, flipping the latest pancake and finally landing it perfectly. Caleb clapped. Daddy did it. The sound, so simple, so pure, went straight through him. It was strange how easily those words had settled into the air now, like they'd been waiting all along. Elena set the table, sneaking glances at him. He'd changed in subtle ways, less polished, more human. There was something raw beneath his calm, a man slowly learning to live without armor. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before, the softness in his voice when he spoke to Caleb, the way he listened, really listened, without reaching for his phone. They ate together, sunlight spilling across the table, pancakes drenched in syrup. Caleb chattered about dinosaurs and space rockets, his words tumbling over one another in excitement. Charles watched him, every sentence sinking deeper into his heart. When breakfast ended, Elena stood to clear the plates, but Charles stopped her. "Let me. You'll put the plates in alphabetical order," she teased. "Probably," he said with a grin, stacking them anyway. When she looked at him, then really looked, it was the first time in years she saw something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. Not the kind that came from power or success, but the kind that came from being exactly where you're meant to be. Later that afternoon, they went to the park. Caleb ran ahead, his laughter echoing through the crisp air. Charles followed with a paper kite tucked under his arm. It was an ordinary day, but to him, it felt extraordinary. He knelt beside his son, helping him hold the string. "All right, ready?" Caleb nodded eagerly. "Ready." The kite caught the wind, soaring high, a flash of red against the blue. Caleb squealed, jumping with delight. "It's flying, Daddy. It's flying." Charles laughed, running beside him, both of them chasing the same invisible wind. For a man who'd once measured life in profit margins, this was the first time he'd felt what true wealth meant. From a bench nearby, Elena watched them, her son's joy, Charles's unguarded laughter, and something inside her began to shift. The past hadn't vanished, but its edges softened. The man she had loved, once then lost, was beginning to return, not as the powerful version the world adored, but as the man who had once held her hand and whispered dreams into her hair. When they finally collapsed on the grass, breathless and laughing, Caleb lay between them, the kite fluttering lazily above. "We made it fly," he said proudly. Charles brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "We did, all three of us." Elena caught his gaze, their eyes locking for a heartbeat too long. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the kite string, but her pulse betrayed her. They walked home together, as dusk began to settle, the city lights, blooming like scattered stars. Caleb's small hand held tightly onto both of theirs, swinging between them in rhythmic innocence. When they reached her doorstep, Charles lingered. "I don't want to overstep, but would it be all right if I tucked him in tonight?" Elena hesitated, but then nodded. "Just tonight." Inside, the house glowed with the warm hush of evening. Caleb brushed his teeth while Charles waited by the bed, smoothing the blanket, unsure if he was doing it right. When the boy returned, pajama-clad and sleepy-eyed, Charles helped him climb under the covers. "Tell me a story," Caleb murmured. Charles smiled, unsure where to begin. "Once upon a time," he said slowly, "there was a man who thought he had everything he could ever want. Big buildings, big plans, big dreams. But one day, he found something small, something so small he almost didn't notice it." "What was it?" Caleb asked, his voice drowsy. Charles's throat tightened. A little boy with brave eyes who taught him what love really means. Caleb smiled sleepily. "That's me." Charles nodded, whispering, "That's you." By the time he looked up, Caleb was already asleep. He stayed for a while, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest, listening to the faint rhythm of soft breaths that seemed to fill the quiet house with meaning. Then he turned toward the doorway, where Elena stood watching him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You're good with him." He smiled faintly. "He makes it easy." "You surprise me," she admitted. "I'm still surprising myself," he said. She leaned against the frame, arms folded. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to get a call and remember you're supposed to be somewhere more important." He took a step closer. "There's nowhere more important than this." Her eyes searched his face. "You mean that now? But what about in 6 months, a year?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. She stiffened instinctively, expecting another meeting, another excuse. But he powered it off, placed it on the table behind her, and said softly, "Then you remind me." Something fragile stirred between them then, like an old melody rediscovered. The silence that followed wasn't cold or distant. It was full, like the quiet that lingers after a heartbeat. When Charles finally left that night, the air between them carried something unspoken but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, routine took root. Saturday breakfasts, Sunday walks, story time in the evenings. Caleb began to expect him to wait by the window with his dinosaur toy until the familiar car pulled up. And every time Elena watched through the curtain pretending she wasn't smiling. But with closeness came vulnerability. One night when rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, Caleb woke crying. Charles was already on the couch finishing paperwork when Elena called softly. "He's asking for you." He didn't hesitate. When he reached Caleb's room, the boy clung to him immediately trembling. "Daddy, the thunder's too loud." Charles gathered him close, rocking gently. "It's just the sky talking, buddy. It can't hurt you." "But what if it's mad?" Charles smiled against his hair. "Then I'll tell it to stop." Caleb laughed quietly, his fear fading. "You can do that. I can try," Charles whispered. Elena stood in the doorway watching them in the dim light. Something about the sight, the strength in his arms, the tenderness in his voice undid her. She felt an ache that was equal parts sorrow and longing. When Caleb finally drifted back to sleep, Charles looked up at her. Neither spoke, but everything that needed saying was there, in his eyes, in hers. After that night, the house seemed to hum differently whenever he was near. Still, fear lingered. One evening, as they sat on the porch after Caleb's bedtime, Elena finally said what had been pressing on her heart. "He's getting attached, Charles." "I am too. I can't." He cut her off gently. "I'm not going anywhere. You said that once before. I was a fool." Then he said simply, "I'm not anymore." She looked away, struggling with the tug of war between hope and caution. "You don't understand what it's like to rebuild trust from ashes." "I do," he said quietly, "because I'm trying to rebuild yours." The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and something clean new. Charles reached out, brushing a raindrop or maybe a tear from her cheek. "You don't have to forgive me yet," he said. "Just let me stay long enough to earn it." Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. And in that moment, under the soft hum of the city night, something unnamed began to grow delicate, uncertain, but alive. When he left that evening, Elena stayed on the porch long after his car disappeared, the scent of rain still clinging to her hair. She thought of the way he'd held Caleb, the way his voice had softened, the way her heart had stopped resisting for just one fragile second. Maybe love didn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it crept back in quietly disguised, as patience disguised as a father learning how to make pancakes. The city wore the calm glow of early evening when Charles parked outside Elena's townhouse, rain still clinging to the edges of his coat. The sky was the color of old silver, and the streetlights had just flickered to life. He sat for a moment watching the light in her window, the shadow of movement, Caleb's laughter spilling faintly into the damp air. Something inside him ached with a tenderness he could barely name. A year ago, his life had been all control numbers, contracts, mergers. Now it pulsed to the rhythm of something terrifyingly fragile, the sound of a child laughing upstairs, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way home again. When Elena opened the door, her expression softened. "You're late." He lifted the small paper bag in his hand. "I stopped to get that chocolate cake Caleb keeps talking about." Her brows lifted. "The one from Maison du Parc. You crossed the entire city for that. Some things are worth the traffic." From the hallway, Caleb's voice echoed "Daddy," and before either of them could move, the boy appeared, running toward him, clutching a half-built Lego airplane. "Look what I made. It can fly and crash and fix itself again. Charles crouched to meet him. A plane that can fix itself. That's magic. Caleb grinned. Mommy says some things can't be fixed, but I think maybe she's wrong. Elena froze for a fraction of a second. Charles's gaze flicked up, meeting hers across the room. Neither spoke, but the moment hung between them like a thread pulled too tight. Dinner was simple pasta laughter, the low hum of music from the kitchen. Charles helped Caleb twirl noodles onto his fork, while Elena watched from across the table, her heart caught somewhere between disbelief and warmth. It had been months now, months of Charles showing up every weekend, every promise kept. He'd learned how to braid stories into bedtime, how to listen instead of command, how to let love make him gentle. And yet, trust was slower to heal. After Caleb had gone to bed, the house quieted. Elena stood by the sink rinsing dishes as the rain picked up again outside. Charles lingered behind her sleeves, rolled to his elbows, drying a plate with quiet precision. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. He smiled. "If I leave you alone with dishes, you'll accuse me of running back to work. Maybe I still don't believe you won't." He set the plate down, leaning against the counter. "Then I'll keep showing you." She turned, then arms crossed loosely, trying to mask the way her pulse quickened. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But the hard things are usually the ones worth doing." Their eyes met, steady, uncertain, but full of something real. And in that charged quiet, Elena realized she no longer recognized the man in front of her. He wasn't the polished stranger who'd once left her behind in pursuit of ambition. He was quieter now, more careful, like someone who'd learned the value of silence. "I didn't expect you to change this much," she murmured. He tilted his head slightly. "Neither did I. Do you miss it? What the life you had? The freedom? The power?" He smiled faintly. "Freedom means nothing if you're lonely inside it." The honesty of that landed between them like a confession. Before either could speak again, Caleb's small voice broke the tension. "Mommy." Elena turned instantly. "Baby, what's wrong?" The boy stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Bad dream." Charles knelt, his voice low, soothing. "Hey, it's all right. You're safe now." Caleb sniffled. "I dreamed you left." For a moment, Charles couldn't find his voice. Then he placed a hand over his son's heart. "That's not happening. Not now. Not ever." Caleb blinked at him, uncertain but hopeful. "Promise." Charles nodded. "Promise." And somehow that word, simple, unpolished, felt like a vow to more than just a child. After tucking Caleb back into bed, Elena lingered by the door, watching Charles sit on the edge of the mattress, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. There was a gentleness in his touch that caught her completely off guard. When he turned, she was still staring. What he asked quietly. Nothing she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I just didn't think you'd fit here. In this life. With us." He rose, stepping closer, his expression unreadable. "Neither did I. But somehow, it's the only place I feel like I belong." Elena's breath faltered. "You're saying all the right things, Charles. But I'm scared of believing them." "Then don't believe them," he said softly. "Just watch them." The words landed deep, disarming her completely. They moved to the living room, the air thick with unspoken emotion. The rain beat softly against the windows, steady and rhythmic. Charles sat on the couch while Elena curled into the armchair opposite, legs drawn up, the lamplight painting her in honey tones. For a while they talked about small things, Caleb's school project, a new bakery near her work, the weather. But beneath the surface, 1,000 unsaid memories stirred. At one point she looked at him and said, "Do you ever think about that night?" He didn't ask which one, He knew. "The night you left," she continued, "you said, 'I'll make it right.' And then you didn't call for weeks." Charles exhaled, guilt etching across his face. "I thought I was giving you space. I thought if I fixed everything out there first, I could come back to you with something to offer. You didn't understand that all I ever wanted was you." Her words cut through him like glass. He swallowed hard. "I do now." Silence, stretched heavy and fragile. Then, as if drawn by something beyond reason, he rose and crossed the small distance between them. He stopped when he was close enough to feel her breath, close enough to see the tremor of uncertainty in her hands. "Elena," he said quietly, "what if we stopped remembering the pain and started writing what comes after?" Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering with conflict. "You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. It's just possible." He didn't touch her, didn't move any closer, but the space between them pulsed with everything unsaid. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, a low echo rolling through the night. Elena rose slowly, the air shifting. "You should go," she said, her voice steady but soft. "It's late." He nodded, though neither of them moved. "All right," he said. "But before I do..." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Caleb drew this last week when I dropped him off. He said it was for both of us." She unfolded it. 3 stick figures again, but this time there was a heart drawn above them, colored bright red, lopsided, but bold. Underneath, in block letters, was the word, "Home." Her voice trembled. "He made this," he said. "It's where he feels safest." Something in her broke then quietly. Charles reached for the doorknob, but hesitated. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "But I need you to know. I'm not trying to rebuild what we had. I'm trying to build something new with you, with him, with who we've both become." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "And if I can't?" He smiled gently. "Then I'll love him anyway. And I'll wait for you." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Elena standing alone in the quiet house, Caleb's drawing trembling in her hand. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist, and through the glass she could see Charles standing on the sidewalk, staring up at the window as though unsure whether to walk away or hope again. He didn't see her watching, but she did, and in that fleeting moment, she realized something she hadn't let herself feel in years. He wasn't trying to win her back. He was learning how to stay. That night, when she finally went upstairs, Caleb stirred in his sleep and mumbled, "Addie's coming back tomorrow." "Right?" Elena brushed a kiss across his forehead. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "He always comes back." Downstairs, she placed the drawing on the mantel, beside a faded photo of her and Charles on their wedding day. 2 people who once believed love could survive anything. Maybe she thought they hadn't been wrong. Just too early. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, drifting past the city lights like small pieces of silence. Elena stood by the window, watching the flakes melt against the glass, her reflection faint beside the shimmer. In the background, soft piano music filled the living room, and the faint sound of Caleb's laughter echoed from the hallway. Charles was there, helping him build a snow fort, out of sofa cushions and blankets, his sleeves rolled up, hair slightly tousled. He looked utterly at home, an image so natural, it ached. Elena smiled despite herself. She'd spent weeks trying not to admit what had already become true. Charles wasn't just visiting anymore. He had woven himself back into the rhythm of their days, the breakfasts, the school drop-offs, the quiet evenings after Caleb fell asleep. But even as routine settled, the space between them remained fragile, filled with unspoken things. When Caleb finally went to bed, the house dimmed into stillness. Charles lingered in the kitchen, pouring them both tea. Steam curled from the mugs, winding between them like something alive. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly. Elena leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Just thinking. About what?" She hesitated. "How strange it feels to have you here. Like we stepped into a life that doesn't quite belong to us yet." He nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a wry smile. "Maybe we're just borrowing time until it decides to keep us." Her gaze dropped to the floor, his words catching her off guard. "You always did know how to sound poetic when you were nervous." "I'm not nervous." "Yes, you are," she said gently. "You always talk softer when something scares you." He laughed under his breath, setting the mugs down. "You remember everything, only the parts that mattered." For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of snow brushing against the window. Finally, Charles said quietly, "You still don't trust me." It wasn't an accusation. It was a truth spoken with care. Elena's throat tightened. "I want to," she admitted. "But trust doesn't just appear because someone says they've changed. It has to be built brick by brick. And I'm afraid that if I start building again, you'll walk away before it's finished." He stepped closer, slow enough that she could have moved away, but didn't. "I'm not walking away." "You say that now. I mean it now." His voice trembled, not with uncertainty, but sincerity. "I can't undo the past, Elena, but I can be here for the present, for every messy, imperfect piece of it." Her eyes glistened. "You always knew what to say." "Back then, I said the right things for the wrong reasons," he murmured. "Now, I'd rather do the right things and say nothing at all." She looked at him, then really looked. The man who once built empires out of pride now stood before her, stripped of armor, offering nothing but honesty. It terrified her. It moved her. She reached for her mug, needing something to hold, and their fingers brushed. The contact was small, but the air shifted instantly. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. "What do you see when you look at me now?" Her lips parted. "I see someone I used to love, someone I'm learning to recognize again." He exhaled slowly, relief mingling with longing. "Then maybe there's still hope." "Hope," she said softly, "is dangerous. So is regret." Their eyes met, and the world seemed to hold still for a heartbeat too long. Then she looked away, breaking the spell. "Tea's getting cold," she murmured, but her voice trembled slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the window, watching the snow fall heavier, now blanketing the street in quiet white. "You know," he said after a while, "I used to think forgiveness was about saying sorry loud enough. But it isn't. It's about showing up quietly, even when you're not sure you'll be welcome." Elena leaned beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Maybe that's why it's harder. Because forgiveness isn't a gift. It's a risk." He turned his head, and their eyes met again, inches apart, closer than they had been in years. "Then I'll risk it." The clock ticked softly in the background, and the space between them filled with the sound of breathing, slow and uneven. Charles reached out, hesitant, searching, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't move, didn't stop him. "Elena," he whispered, "I've missed you in ways I don't even have words for." Her eyes closed. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because it makes everything harder." "Maybe harder is what we need," he said quietly. The air trembled around them. He didn't kiss her. He didn't have to. The weight of what hung between them was already enough, too much almost. Then, as if remembering herself, Elena stepped back, her breath shaky. "You should go. It's late." Charles nodded, his expression unreadable but tender. All right. He gathered his coat, pausing by the door. Elena. She looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, he said. But when you do, even a little, just know I'll be here. Still trying, still choosing this. And before she could answer, he stepped into the snow, the door closing softly behind him. Elena stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, her heart heavy and light all at once. Outside, his footsteps faded, but the warmth he left lingered like the memory of a touch that hadn't quite happened. When she turned back to the window, the snow had stopped falling. The world outside was still white and quiet, like a blank page waiting for the next chapter. And though she wouldn't admit it, she was already wondering what it might look like if she let him write it with her. The new year came quietly. No fireworks, no champagne, just a hush that seemed to settle over the city like a collective breath. Inside the townhouse, the fireplace crackled low, painting the room in flickers of gold. Elena sat on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading, while Charles knelt on the rug with Caleb helping him assemble a jigsaw puzzle of the night sky. Every few minutes, Caleb would lift a piece, squint at it, then glance up for approval. Does this one go here? Charles leaned closer, his tone patient. Almost. Try turning it around. Caleb rotated the piece, and when it fit his smile, lit up the room. I did it. Elena found herself watching them again, the gentle rhythm of their laughter, the ease with which Charles had slipped into their small world. He didn't just visit anymore. He existed in the spaces that used to feel empty. When Caleb went to bed, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was familiar. But underneath that comfort, something new pulsed, like the faint tremor of a bridge being rebuilt. Charles lingered by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the snow gather along the street. He's growing fast, he murmured. Elena set her book aside. He is. Too fast sometimes. He turned toward her, his voice quieter now. He reminds me of you. She arched a brow. That's funny. He reminds me of you, stubborn and impossible to argue with. He smiled faintly. So he's doomed either way. Their laughter faded into something softer, a silence that wasn't about distance but memory. After a moment, Charles said, Elena, can I ask you something? She nodded. Do you ever regret it, us? The question hung there, fragile as breath. Elena looked down at her hands. Sometimes I regret how it ended, not what it was. He studied her face, the way her eyes softened at the edges when she spoke of the past. I used to think love meant never failing someone, he said quietly, but maybe it just means coming back when you do. She didn't answer right away. The clock ticked softly. The snow fell. The world outside moved on, but inside, time held its breath. You did come back, she said finally, but it doesn't erase what happened. I know, he said, but maybe it can mean something different now. Elena rose from the couch, moving toward the fireplace. You talk like forgiveness is a choice you can make once and be done with it. It's not. It's something I have to keep deciding every day. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough for her to feel the quiet steadiness of him. Then I'll keep earning it every day. She turned to him, searching his face. Why now, Charles? Why, after all this time? He hesitated, then said softly, because I finally realized that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I thought I could live without the noise of love, but I was wrong. The silence was worse. Her chest tightened. The way he spoke, steady, stripped of ego, felt different now. It wasn't a confession meant to impress. It was an apology meant to heal. I'm still angry, she whispered. Not all the time, but sometimes when I remember how alone I felt. You're allowed to be, he said. I don't want to hold on to it forever. Then don't, he said gently. Let it fall apart like everything else we outgrew. She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears that didn't fall. You make it sound easy. He shook his head. It's not easy, but it's possible. And I'd rather spend the rest of my life proving it than pretending it doesn't matter. The air between them hummed fragile and alive. Elena wanted to step back to keep the distance safe, but her heart betrayed her. The truth was, she'd missed him. Not the version who broke promises, but the one who now stood in front of her present patient, changed. Outside, a wind stirred scattering snowflakes across the window pane. You should go, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's late. He nodded slowly but didn't move. I'll go, he said softly. But before I do, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a puzzle piece. Elena frowned. You took one? He smiled faintly. No. Caleb slipped it in my hand before he went to bed. Said it's the missing star. Her throat tightened. I think he meant it for both of us. Charles said, placing it on the mantel. Something unfinished. Something worth finding. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire, the snow against the glass. Then quietly he added, I'm not asking you to love me the way you did before. I just hope one day you'll let me stay. Elena's lips parted, but no words came. Charles gave her a small, tired smile, the kind that said he understood even her silence. Then he turned his footsteps soft against the floor and left without another word. The door closed. The house fell still. Elena stood there staring at the tiny puzzle piece glinting in the firelight. She reached out, tracing it with her fingertip, and felt something stir deep inside, a fragile, stubborn kind of hope she wasn't ready to name yet. Upstairs, Caleb's sleepy voice floated down the hallway. Mommy? She turned toward the sound. What is it, sweetheart? Did Daddy find the star yet? Elena hesitated. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, Not yet. But I think he's close. When she returned to the window, the snow had stopped. The street was empty, washed in silver moonlight. She stood there. Her reflection blurred against the glass, and for the first time in years, the weight on her chest felt lighter, like the beginning of forgiveness, quiet and unannounced. Spring came softly that year, unfolding like a promise no one had dared to make. The city thawed beneath pale sunlight, and the air carried that fragile scent of beginnings, wet earth, blooming magnolias, the hum of life returning after too long a winter. Elena stood in her small garden, trimming the edges of the rose bushes, lost in thought. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was far away, caught between what had been and what was still uncertain. It had been 2 months since the night Charles had left the puzzle piece on her mantel. 2 months of quiet phone calls about Caleb's drawings, school recitals, and silly bedtime stories. 2 months of small kindnesses, unspoken, steady, deliberate. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't vanished either. He had simply stayed. This morning he'd texted, Can I stop by later? There's something I'd like to show you. She'd stared at the message for a long time before replying. When the sound of his car finally rolled into the driveway, her heart responded before her reason did. She wiped her hands, smoothing her hair, as if it mattered. It always did when it came to him. Charles stepped out holding something wrapped in brown paper. His expression was calm, but his eyes, those familiar storm-gray eyes, held a kind of quiet intensity she hadn't seen in years. You've been gardening, he said, glancing around. Looks beautiful. Helps me think, she replied softly. You brought something. He nodded, unwrapping the package. Inside was a wooden frame, holding a photo, Caleb, laughing, his arms thrown around both of them from behind. She remembered that day, a picnic by the lake. She had forgotten someone had taken a picture. "I had it printed," Charles said. "Thought it deserved a place somewhere you'd see it." Her fingers brushed the frame. "It's beautiful." "So are you," he said quietly. The words fell between them, gentle but certain. She looked up, startled by how natural they sounded on his tongue again, like they had been waiting all this time to return. "Elena," he said, taking a step closer, "I don't want to live in the waiting anymore. I know what I lost. I know what I broke. But I also know what I want to build now." Her breath caught. "And what's that?" He smiled faintly. "A life that's not measured by success or control. Just moments. Real ones. Messy ones. With you. With him." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he said. "But it's honest. I spent years thinking love was something to manage. You taught me it's something to trust." She swallowed hard, tears threatening. "You think trust can just come back?" "No," he said softly. "But I think love can wait for it." He reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a small, familiar object. The missing puzzle piece. Elena blinked. "You still have it?" He nodded. "It didn't feel right putting it back until we were ready. But maybe now we are." She took it from him, her hands trembling slightly. Then, without a word, she walked to the living room, where the half-finished night sky puzzle still lay on the side table. The final piece slid into place perfectly, the picture whole again, an image of a star burning brighter than the rest. When she turned, Charles was standing behind her. His expression was open, uncertain, almost vulnerable. "It's not about perfection anymore," he said quietly. "It's about showing up for what matters." Elena took a slow breath. "You've changed, Charles." He smiled gently. "You made sure of that." She stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of his breath, the quiet thrum of a heartbeat that no longer raced with ambition, but steadied with something deeper. "I'm still scared," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted. "But maybe fear's just proof that it matters." And then, as if the world itself had been holding its breath for this moment, she reached up, fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the familiar curve of his mouth, and kissed him. It wasn't a desperate kiss, or one born of nostalgia. It was soft, certain, and slow, a promise, written in touch rather than words. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for the past to be forgotten, only forgiven. When they pulled apart, her forehead rested against his chest, and for the first time in years, the silence between them felt like peace. From upstairs, Caleb's voice broke the stillness. "Mommy, Daddy, are you done talking?" They both laughed, real laughter, the kind that untangled everything heavy. Charles cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the trace of a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You know he's been calling me Daddy every day now." "I know," she said, smiling. "He told me he doesn't have to ask if you're coming back anymore." Charles's eyes softened. "That's because I already am." Outside, the sky was breaking into light, the kind of gold that makes everything look touched by forgiveness. Elena looked at him, then truly looked, and realized something profound. Love hadn't returned as a storm. It had come back like dawn, quiet, patient, inevitable. He took her hand. "Dinner tonight. Just the three of us." She nodded, her smile, small but sure. "I'll make something simple." "Perfect," he said. "Simple. Sounds like home." Later that evening, as laughter filled the kitchen, Elena caught her reflection in the window, the three of them together, a frame of warmth against the darkening sky, and she realized something she hadn't dared to believe for years. Sometimes the heart doesn't need to start over. It just needs to come home. So if you've ever loved and lost, if you've ever wondered whether second chances exist, remember this. Love doesn't always arrive loud or perfect. Sometimes it just knocks again softly, waiting for you to open the door. Because no matter how far we drift, the right love always finds its way back home.